It was a damp autumn night in Sicily, the kind of night where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. The moon hung low over the hills, casting a pale silver glow across the cobblestone paths and the ancient stone walls of a small Sicilian village. Somewhere in the distance, the toll of a bell echoed through the air, announcing the passing of another soul into the realm beyond. But for one widow, the passage was anything but peaceful. The year was 1866, a time when the old world clung to ancient traditions, superstition was woven into everyday life, and death was not an ending but a threshold to something far more mysterious. In this quiet corner of Sicily, a story would emerge that would disturb not only the local village but also leave an unsettling mark on history. A tale that would weave together grief, defiance, fear, and the question of what truly lies beyond the grave. The story begins with a woman whose name has faded into whispers. A widow, bound by sorrow, who was expected to follow the natural course of life and death. But instead, she chose to resist it, to refuse the grave itself. When her time came, she would defy the very order of nature, challenging the beliefs of her time and shaking the fragile certainty of the living and the dead. On the surface, it could sound like nothing more than a local oddity, the sort of story told around fires to frighten children or amuse travelers. But this was more than superstition. It was a real case that drew the attention of neighbors, clergy, and eventually authorities. It became a subject of whispers in churches, arguments in taverns, and questions in the courts. For some, it was a miracle. For others, a scandal. And for all, it became a chilling reminder of the thin line between life and death. The widow's refusal of her grave did not come as a gentle protest, but as an event wrapped in drama and horror. There were conflicting accounts, some claiming she awoke in her coffin, others insisting her refusal was the result of a curse or divine will. Rumors spread quickly, stories of restless spirits, of premature burial, and of bodies that returned from beyond the grave to haunt the living. In the imagination of Sicily, where faith and fear danced together, her case became more than a personal tragedy. It became a legend. But what truly happened that night in 1866? Did she awaken before her burial, trapped between life and death? Was it an act of desperation born from unbearable grief? Or was there something darker at work, a mystery that no amount of science or faith could explain? This documentary will take you into that strange world, to walk through the narrow alleys of Sicilian villages, to hear the voices of eyewitnesses long silenced, and to piece together the truth behind one of the most disturbing cases in Macabre history. You will meet the widow, not only as a name in an old record but as a living figure in a story that blends history, superstition, and the human fear of the unknown. As we delve deeper, we will explore the Sicily of the 19th century, a land where life and death existed in a fragile balance, and where the line between reality and myth was often blurred. We will examine burial customs, the shadow of superstition, the role of the church, and the whispers of science. Above all, we will search for answers to a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Can one truly refuse the grave? By the end of this journey, you will not just know the story of the widow who defied death, you will feel it. The fear, the grief, the mystery. And perhaps, in the silence that follows, you will find yourself wondering if the grave is ever truly final. To truly understand the strange story of the widow who refused the grave, we must first step into Sicily as it was in the mid-19th century. Sicily of 1866 was a land suspended between past and future, a place where ancient traditions still held sway, where superstition and faith intertwined, and where death was surrounded by rituals as old as memory itself. The island had just emerged from a turbulent period. Italy was undergoing unification, and Sicily was caught between old feudal traditions and a new national identity. But change came slowly to the island's villages. In rural Sicily, life remained rooted in centuries of custom. People lived close to the land, worked under the shadow of ancient churches, and followed traditions passed down through generations. In these small communities, life was intimate, but death was communal, an event that touched every household, every neighbor, every street. Death in 19th century Sicily was not simply an ending. It was a journey. Burial was not a mere practical necessity but a deeply spiritual rite. Funerals were elaborate affairs, blending Catholic ceremony with centuries-old folk beliefs. The ritual was a matter of honor, a way to ensure the departed reached rest without lingering in torment. Families would guard the body with care, preparing it for its final journey. Mourning was marked by visible signs, black clothing, veils, laments, and days of prayer. But alongside these religious customs lived a profound fear, the fear of death not as a final end but as a trap. Across Europe, and especially in rural Italy, stories of premature burial were whispered from village to village. People feared being buried alive, trapped in a coffin while still conscious, unable to cry out. These fears were not unfounded. Medical knowledge in the 19th century was far from perfect. Without modern technology, determining true death was often uncertain. Conditions such as catalepsy, coma, or severe illness could leave a person in a state that mimicked death. The line between life and death was perilously thin. In Sicily, this fear took on a unique shape, colored by local superstition. Folklore told of restless spirits wandering graveyards, of the dead returning to demand justice or revenge. The concept of the mort retardata, a delayed death, haunted the collective imagination. Superstition held that if a burial was conducted improperly, the soul might not rest, and the body could rise again. Such beliefs were not fringe. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Families built special rituals to guard against them: night watches over the body, charms placed with the corpse, and specific prayers to secure peace in the afterlife. This was the Sicily in which the widow lived. A world where religion and superstition coexisted, where death was both sacred and terrifying. It was a place where the line between myth and reality could blur in the dim light of candlelit chapels and graveyards. But Sicily of 1866 was also a place of deep inequality and rigid social order. The church held enormous influence, both spiritually and politically. Clergy were not only religious leaders but moral authorities, tasked with guiding the living and safeguarding the souls of the dead. To refuse burial was not just an act of personal choice, it was a challenge to the authority of the church, a defiance of a system that controlled life, death, and the afterlife. It was in this cultural and spiritual atmosphere that the widow's story unfolded. Her refusal of the grave was not just an isolated act. It was an event that touched the deepest fears and beliefs of her time. To the villagers, it was more than a case of one woman's defiance. It was a confrontation with their own mortality, a challenge to the boundaries between life and death. Understanding this context is crucial, for the widow's actions cannot be divorced from the world she lived in. Her decision, or whatever force compelled her, existed within a web of faith, fear, tradition, and superstition. It was a world where death was not merely a medical fact but a cultural and spiritual event, a world where the refusal of the grave was something far more profound than a mere act of rebellion. As we move forward into the story itself, we must keep this world in mind. The widow did not live in isolation. She lived in a society that was shaped by centuries of ritual, belief, and fear, a society in which death was never silent, and where every burial told a story not only of the dead but of the living who remained behind. It is here, in this rich and shadowed world, that our story begins to unfold, the story of grief, defiance, and mystery that would become known across Sicily as the tale of the widow who refused the grave. Before she became the widow who defied death, she was a woman shaped by a life of toil, love, loss, and sorrow. Her name, though lost to time in official records, still lingers in whispered recollections passed down through generations in that Sicilian village. To understand her final, extraordinary act, we must first know the life she lived. She was born in a small farming community somewhere in the rolling hills of Sicily, the daughter of peasants who worked their land under the sun and prayed under the stars. Life was hard, shaped by seasons, by labor, and by tradition. From a young age, she would have known the rhythms of survival: planting and harvest, bread-making, the singing of hymns at dawn, and the quiet mourning of the dead at night. Her marriage was arranged, as was common in Sicily at the time, a joining of families, of land, and of fortunes. Her husband, a man of modest means but steadfast character, was a partner in both life and labor. Together they eked out a life in a small stone home, tending olive groves, raising children, and upholding the traditions of their ancestors. Yet, life in 19th century Sicily was never free of hardship. Illness was common, food was scarce at times, and death walked close to every household. The bonds of marriage were tested by the unpredictable tides of fate. And for her, fate would take a cruel turn. It was during the winter of 1865 that her world began to unravel. Her husband fell ill. The illness came quietly at first, a fever that would not break, a cough that deepened into wheezing, a pallor that stole his strength. Doctors in the village were scarce, and those who practiced medicine were guided as much by superstition as science. Treatments were rudimentary: herbal infusions, prayers, and rituals meant to call upon divine aid. But his condition worsened, and soon he was bedbound. The village watched with sympathy and fear. To be stricken by illness in such a close-knit community was both a personal tragedy and a shared one. Neighbors came to offer comfort, to bring food, and to pray at his bedside. Yet, despite their efforts, he died one cold January night. The widow, now alone, was left with the weight of grief heavier than any she had ever known. Her mourning was profound. For weeks she dressed in black, spoke little, and kept vigil at his grave. In the heart of her sorrow, something began to grow, a deep unease. There were nights when she dreamt of her husband rising from his coffin, of him calling to her in the darkness. The village elders whispered that she was cursed, that her grief had opened a door between worlds. She began to speak of strange sensations, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, feeling a presence near her bed, seeing shadows that moved without source. The death of her husband was not merely a loss, it was the beginning of her descent into a state that the village would later call unnatural. She began to withdraw from the living, speaking less with her neighbors and more with the silence of her home. Her eyes seemed to hold a fear that no comfort could erase. And in her heart, a growing dread took root, a dread of the grave itself. It is unclear whether she feared her own death or feared what might come after. But the stories of the time suggest both. In Sicily, where faith and superstition intertwined, death was not an end but a transition. To die was to enter another world, and to be buried was to take the final step. For her, that final step became a thing to resist, to reject. When she fell ill later that year, weaker, pale, and trembling, she spoke openly of her fear. She told those who came to her bedside that she did not wish to be buried alive. She begged for assurances, rituals, prayers. Some say she demanded to be watched until the last breath was certain. Others say she swore she would not enter the grave at all. Her words were not dismissed entirely. The villagers, steeped in their own fears of premature burial, listened with unease. But for her, it was no idle concern. Her health declined. The illness that took her husband now claimed her. The same cold shadow that had touched him reached her as well. And when the time came, she lay in her bed, surrounded by those who had once known her laughter and work, now gathered to witness the final moment of her life. But the moment was not what they expected. Her death would not be simple. It would become an event that shattered the fragile order of her village. What followed her passing, her refusal of the grave, would become a story that lived far beyond the walls of her home, beyond the boundaries of Sicily itself. To truly understand her act, we must hold on to this portrait of her life, a life marked by hard labor, deep loss, unshakable fear, and the persistent shadow of superstition. It was not an isolated act of defiance. It was the culmination of years of grief, belief, and dread. It was a choice born from the intersection of personal tragedy and cultural fear. And in that choice, her story became something more than a tale of one woman. It became a mirror of the fears of her age, a window into a world where death was not final, where the grave was not the end, and where the refusal of rest could become a challenge to the order of life itself. It was early spring of 1866 when the events that would etch the widow's story into legend began to unfold. The air in the village was still cool from winter, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. Yet beneath the quiet of that morning, a tension had settled over the household where she lay. Friends, family, and neighbors were gathered, some with expressions of sorrow, others with unease. They were not only preparing for a burial, they were standing at the edge of a mystery. The widow had been ill for days. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale, her pulse faint. Local healers had long given up hope, and the priest had been called to offer last rites. For those present, it seemed certain, her life was at its end. Yet among those who watched her final hours, unease lingered. Stories of her own fears of premature burial had spread. The thought that she might be buried alive haunted them. It was a superstition deeply rooted in Sicilian tradition, and her own words, spoken repeatedly in her last days, had made those fears tangible. When the priest declared her dead, the room fell silent. The body was carefully washed and prepared for burial according to custom. Candles were lit, prayers murmured. The coffin was closed. Yet, as the bearers carried her toward the cemetery, a strange ripple of doubt passed through the crowd. Some claimed they saw her eyelids tremble, others whispered of a faint gasp. But in the shadows of that small village, such signs could be explained away, or they could be signs of something far darker. At the cemetery, the coffin was lowered into the earth. The air was heavy with incense and the voices of prayers. Mourners stepped back, awaiting the moment when the earth would cover the final resting place. And then it happened. A sound, faint but undeniable. A thud, followed by a muffled cry. Gasps broke out among the crowd. The coffin lid shifted. Panic spread. The gravediggers rushed forward. They opened the coffin. Inside lay the widow, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She was alive. What followed was chaos. Screams echoed through the cemetery. The villagers recoiled in fear. The priest stepped forward, insisting it was a miracle, proof that her soul had refused to leave the world. Others suspected darker forces at work. Some accused her of trickery. A few whispered that she had been bewitched. Whatever the truth, her survival became a matter of fierce debate and deep fear. But for the widow herself, it was neither triumph nor salvation. Her voice, when she spoke, was trembling and low. She claimed she had known the moment she was placed in the grave. She spoke of sensations she could not name, of being dragged somewhere between light and darkness, of a cold silence that pressed upon her soul. She said she had fought to return, driven by a force she could not explain. The priest ordered an immediate examination. But there was no answer. Some said she had been in a coma-like state. Others insisted she had truly crossed the line between life and death. Medical knowledge of the time could offer no certainty. The case became the center of a growing storm in the village. Some feared her as one touched by the supernatural. Others saw her survival as proof of God's will. The incident became a scandal, whispered about in homes and markets for months afterward. The coffin itself became an object of fascination and fear. Locked away by the church, it was said that no one dared to open it again. The grave, they whispered, had been disturbed not once but twice, first by her awakening and then by the terrible decision that followed. For the widow, the incident was not a closed chapter. She refused burial again. She demanded that her body never be lowered into the earth. It was no longer a matter of superstition alone. It was a vow. To her, the grave had become a place of terror, a realm she could not return to willingly. This refusal brought the case into the public eye in ways that transcended her village. Local newspapers began to report the strange event. Clergy debated it in sermons. Scholars and curious travelers made their way to the village to see for themselves. The widow became more than a grieving woman. She became a symbol, a figure at the intersection of grief, faith, and the unexplainable. But her defiance would not go unanswered. The church and the law regarded her decision as a challenge. To refuse burial was to question not only the sanctity of tradition but the authority of God and church over the fate of the dead. For the villagers, it became a question that went far beyond one woman's body. It was a question about the boundaries of life and death itself. What happened in that cemetery, whether accident, miracle, or something darker, would remain a mystery. But her refusal of the grave would become her legacy. It was a defiance that echoed through Sicilian folklore, a case that would be remembered for generations as one of the most haunting incidents of the 19th century. And in the shadows of that story lies a deeper truth, the human fear of being forgotten, of losing control over the moment of death, of the unknown that comes after. Her act was more than defiance, it was a declaration. That the grave, no matter how certain, could still be refused. To understand the widow's refusal of the grave, we must first understand a fear that gripped not only Sicily but much of the world in the 19th century, the fear of being buried alive. This dread was not mere superstition. It was born of real uncertainty, tragic accidents, and centuries of cultural belief. For many in that era, burial was a risk, not a certainty. The science of determining death in the 1800s was far from precise. Without modern technology, doctors relied on the senses, listening for breath, checking a pulse, and feeling the body for signs of life. But conditions such as catalepsy, coma, or diseases that slowed the body's functions could easily mimic death. Reports of premature burial were not uncommon. Newspapers of the time carried shocking accounts, families who exhumed loved ones only to find them with disturbed coffins, signs of scratches inside, or other evidence that suggested the dead had fought for air. These fears gave birth to an entire cultural awareness surrounding death. Across Europe, inventors and physicians developed safety coffins designed with mechanisms that would allow the living to signal if they awoke underground. Bells, flags, ventilation tubes, and even feeding tubes were designed to prevent the horror of premature burial. In London and Paris, these devices became widely discussed topics, as both medical and public fascination with the subject grew. In Sicily, the fear of premature burial had deep roots in folklore. Here, death was not merely a biological event. It was a sacred transition overseen by ritual and prayer. The act of burial carried great importance, and families took elaborate care to ensure it was performed correctly. They believed that improper burial could leave the soul restless, wandering between the world of the living and the dead. There were strict customs for preparing a body. Prayers were recited over the corpse, holy water sprinkled, and specific rites performed to ensure the soul departed in peace. But beyond religion, there was a darker belief. Among Sicilian peasants, stories persisted of the mort retardata, a delayed death, in which the body seemed lifeless but had not truly departed. Folklore was filled with tales of coffins rattled from within, of cries heard at night from the grave, and of bodies exhumed in a state of partial life. These were not considered mere ghost stories. They were cautionary tales told to ensure vigilance in death. For the widow, these fears were real and personal. Her own life had been steeped in the traditions of her village. She had seen illness and death closely, had witnessed the passing of neighbors and relatives, and had heard the whispered warnings of the old. Her husband's slow death had only heightened those fears. And her own condition in her final days, pale, weak, and seemingly lifeless, would have seemed to her and those around her a perilous invitation to that dread. In many ways, her refusal of burial was an extension of this fear. It was a demand for certainty, an insistence that her death be verified beyond doubt. In the eyes of her village, she was no longer simply a grieving widow. She was a figure who embodied one of the greatest terrors of the age, the possibility of being trapped in the coffin, conscious and powerless. Burial itself was a sacred ceremony. In Sicily, it was accompanied by a procession, prayers, and rituals designed to ensure the soul's passage. But the fear of premature burial often led to additional measures. Families sometimes kept vigil beside the coffin, watching through the night to confirm the passing. Bells were placed above graves in some regions, and the practice of watching the dead became part of the culture. This was not merely an act of mourning but an act of protection, a safeguard against the ultimate horror. It was within this cultural context that the widow's story gained deeper meaning. Her refusal of the grave was not an isolated eccentricity but a choice embedded in the fears and traditions of her time. In refusing burial, she was, in effect, rejecting the possibility that her death could be uncertain, rejecting the thought of being forgotten, of lying in the earth while still breathing. But her defiance carried weight beyond personal fear. It challenged the customs of her community, the authority of the church, and the shared belief that burial was the final and unquestionable step. To refuse the grave was to question the very rituals that bound life and death together in Sicily. The fear of premature burial was not just a relic of superstition. It was a cultural force that shaped the way people approached death. In the widow's case, it became a profound and tragic reality. Her act of refusal echoed through the village not merely as a personal choice, but as a confrontation with a deep and ancient fear. It is here, in the shadow of that fear, that her story truly begins to deepen. What followed her defiance was not only a challenge to tradition but a mystery that would haunt Sicily for decades. It was a moment when grief, superstition, and the unknown collided, and the world was forced to ask, what does it mean to truly be dead? The widow's refusal of her grave did more than shock a village. It sent ripples through the church, the law, and the public conscience. In Sicily of 1866, to deny burial was to deny more than a bodily act. It was to confront centuries of religious tradition, to challenge the authority of the clergy, and to disturb the fragile order of life and death. The Catholic Church in Sicily held great power. It was the final voice in matters of life and death. Burial rites were not merely customs, they were sacred duties. They ensured the soul's passage into eternity, guarded the living against the restless dead, and upheld the moral fabric of the community. To refuse burial was not simply personal defiance, it was a challenge to divine order. When news of the widow's refusal spread, it became a matter of grave concern for the church. Clergy gathered, not merely to examine her request, but to decide whether it constituted heresy or sacrilege. Sermons in the surrounding villages soon began to speak of her case, some calling it a warning against pride and defiance, others framing it as a sign of divine mystery. The matter was no longer private. It became a question of moral and spiritual authority. At the same time, the law began to take notice. Burial was not only a religious matter but also a legal one. In Sicily, the disposal of bodies was regulated to ensure public health, social order, and religious observance. To deny burial created legal complications. It left bodies in limbo, unresolved disputes over ownership of remains, and questions about the rights of the dead and their families. The widow's refusal forced these questions into the open. The local magistrates were called in. They convened discussions with the priest, village elders, and her surviving family. Each voice carried weight, but none could offer a resolution without controversy. The villagers were divided. Some sympathized with her fear, others feared the disruption of sacred rites, and a few whispered of curses and divine retribution. Public reaction was swift and passionate. The village square became a place of debate. Conversations in markets and taverns shifted toward the widow's case. Was she driven by genuine fear, madness, or something darker? Should her wishes be respected, or should the grave be enforced to preserve order and faith? Newspapers in nearby towns began to report the incident, turning it into a scandal that spread beyond Sicily. The widow's refusal became a topic of gossip, philosophical debate, and moral questioning. The church responded with urgency. Clergy visited her home, urging her to accept the rites of burial in the name of God and peace for her soul. They preached about the sanctity of death, the importance of ritual, and the danger of resisting divine will. They warned that to reject burial was to invite unrest for the living and the dead alike. Her case became a theological matter, a test of faith, obedience, and the limits of human will. But the widow refused. Her voice, though weak, was firm. She spoke of her fears of premature burial, of restless spirits, and of the terror she had felt in her own death. To her, burial was not a final blessing but a potential imprisonment. Her defiance was not mere stubbornness. It was an assertion of her own understanding of death. The church's position hardened. A public declaration was made, warning that to resist burial was an affront to God and an act that could bring spiritual danger. The local bishop sent envoys to investigate, and the matter became entangled in religious debate across the region. Sermons spoke of the widow's case as both a miracle and a scandal, framing it as a cautionary tale about the limits of human will. The law moved cautiously but decisively. Officials weighed public safety, health regulations, and the demands of the church. Burial laws in Sicily required that bodies be interred in consecrated ground, and to defy that requirement was to challenge civil order. Yet here was a case where custom, law, and human fear collided. The authorities faced a dilemma. To force burial against her will could spark public outrage and unrest. To allow refusal risked undermining tradition and the rule of law. This standoff became a spectacle. News spread beyond the village, reaching neighboring towns and eventually the cities. Journalists and pamphleteers seized on the story, each presenting their own interpretation, some sympathetic, others sensational. For the church and the law, her case was not just a matter of ritual or legal procedure. It became a symbol of the fragile balance between faith, custom, and human rights. In the months that followed, the widow's story dominated conversation in Sicily. She became a figure of legend, her defiance discussed in churchyards and courtrooms alike. Her case raised questions that went far beyond her own fate. Who owns the body of the dead? Who decides when the grave is final? And what place does fear, and the human will, have in the face of death? The widow's refusal had become something far greater than a personal act. It had become a challenge to the very foundation of Sicilian belief, law, and tradition. In that small village, and beyond, her story would come to represent a collision of faith, fear, and defiance, a collision that would haunt Sicily for decades to come. Her case stood as a reminder that death, for all its certainty, remains one of the great mysteries, and that in some moments, the living will rise to challenge even what seems inevitable. The story of the widow who refused the grave did not fade with time. On the contrary, it grew into something far larger, a matter of public curiosity, moral debate, and official inquiry. What happened that day in the cemetery was not simply a personal matter. It had become a mystery that demanded answers. And so, the authorities, clergy, and scholars began to investigate. The investigation was not simple. In 1866, Sicily had limited resources for scientific inquiry. Medicine was in its infancy, and death was understood through both faith and rudimentary science. But the widow's case was unusual enough to attract attention. It was no longer simply about grief or superstition. This was a matter where the boundaries of life and death themselves were questioned. First to act were the local magistrates. They convened meetings in the village, bringing together witnesses, priests, doctors, and family members. The aim was to piece together the sequence of events, to understand how she could have been declared dead and later found alive in her coffin. Witness testimonies painted a picture both chilling and inconsistent. Some villagers claimed they had seen her breathe faintly before the coffin was sealed. Others insisted they heard her call out, faintly, in the quiet of the church before the funeral. A few spoke of trembling eyelids and restless movement in the hours before burial. But these accounts were contradictory. In a small village steeped in superstition, even the simplest sign could be interpreted as proof of a miracle, a curse, or an omen. The priest who performed her last rites gave testimony. He swore she had shown no signs of life when he anointed her body. He described the rituals performed with solemnity, insisting that there could be no doubt she was truly dead. But his words did little to quell the growing unease. For many, the question was no longer about proof, it was about fear. Medical testimony was scarce but intriguing. A local doctor, called to examine her before burial, offered a theory that reflected the limits of medicine at the time. He suggested that she might have been in a state of catalepsy, a condition in which the body appears lifeless while consciousness remains suspended. Catalepsy was poorly understood then, and the idea of a patient waking after burial was enough to send shivers through even the most skeptical. The Church responded by commissioning its own examination. Clergy and scholars debated whether her survival was a sign of divine intervention or a warning from God. Sermons in nearby towns began to reference her case. To the faithful, it became a question of morality and the soul. Was her awakening proof of the afterlife, or a test of human obedience to divine will? Public curiosity drew more than just the religious and legal authorities. Travelers, journalists, and curious onlookers began to visit the village. Some came to see the widow for themselves, others came to witness the grave, now a place of whispered fear. Local markets became filled with discussions of her case. It was no longer just her story, it was a phenomenon that had captured the imagination of the region. Letters were sent to newspapers and scholars in Palermo and Naples. Medical journals debated the possibility of premature burial. Clerical records began to mention her as a case study of both faith and fear. Her story spread far beyond the small village, becoming a symbol of one of the great mysteries of human existence, the exact moment of death. Yet despite the investigation, no definitive answer emerged. There were no witnesses who could agree on what they had seen. No medical proof could confirm whether she had been truly dead or in a suspended state of life. And no theological consensus could declare her a miracle or a fraud. The mystery deepened further when some began to question her own account. She spoke of a sensation of being pulled between worlds, of a cold silence and a darkness she could not name. To believers, these words were proof of divine mystery. To skeptics, they were signs of delusion or fear. But to the people of her village, they became part of the legend. The investigation ultimately left the case unresolved. No report could declare with certainty whether she had truly been buried alive, nor could it explain why she refused to be buried afterward. What remained was a story filled with unanswered questions, a story that blurred the lines between fact and folklore. For the villagers, the investigation was not merely a search for truth. It was a confrontation with something far more unsettling, the possibility that death itself could be uncertain. The widow's case became a living question that echoed through homes and churches alike, a question that would haunt Sicily long after the matter of her grave had faded from memory. Her story became a paradox. It was at once a legal and theological controversy, a medical mystery, and a piece of folklore. The investigation had uncovered no final answers, only deeper uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lay the reason her story endured. The widow's defiance of the grave was no longer just an act of fear. It had become a mystery that challenged the very understanding of life and death. And it was a mystery that demanded to be told, not only as a strange incident of history but as a haunting reminder of the fragile boundary that separates the living from the dead. By the time the story of the widow who refused the grave reached beyond her village, it had already become a subject of debate, fascination, and fear. Yet the truth of her case remained elusive. No single explanation could satisfy the multitude of questions it had raised. And so, theories began to multiply, some rooted in science, others in faith, and some in the realm of the supernatural. For the medical community of the time, her case became a haunting example of a mystery they could not fully explain. Doctors and scholars debated whether she had been in a state of catalepsy or suspended animation. Catalepsy, a rare condition in which the body becomes rigid and the pulse nearly disappears, was known to science but poorly understood. In an age before modern diagnostic tools, distinguishing between true death and such a condition was almost impossible. A man or woman could appear dead for hours, even days, only to awaken later. For physicians, her case was a chilling reminder of the limits of their knowledge. Some doctors suggested a second possibility, that the widow may have suffered from a form of deep coma caused by illness, exhaustion, or shock. Such states could slow bodily functions to near invisibility, creating the illusion of death. In an era when medical examination was crude and the fear of premature burial was widespread, such cases fed the imagination of the public. Newspapers reported similar incidents from across Europe, fueling the sense that this was not merely superstition but a real danger. But science was not the only explanation offered. Among villagers and clergy, there was a different interpretation, one steeped in faith and superstition. To many in Sicily, her survival was proof that she had been touched by the divine. Some believed it was a miracle, an answer to her prayers, or even a sign from God. Others saw it as a punishment, proof that her defiance of burial was a transgression that kept her trapped between life and death. Then there were those who looked for darker causes. In whispered corners of the village, people spoke of curses, witchcraft, and restless spirits. Sicily had a long tradition of ghost stories, of superstitions tied to burial and death. To the fearful mind of her time, it was not impossible to believe that some unseen force had intervened. The idea of a body returning from the grave was woven deeply into folklore. Stories of the dead rising, of spirits wandering cemeteries, and of graves disturbed by unknown hands were not just stories, they were a part of the cultural fabric. For some scholars of the time, the widow's account was evidence of a psychological phenomenon. They pointed to the power of fear and grief. Could her own dread of premature burial have influenced her perception of death? Could it have created a state in which mind and body seemed to part and return? This theory drew on emerging ideas in psychology, a discipline still in its infancy, suggesting that the mind could alter the body's functions in profound and mysterious ways. Even within the church, speculation was divided. Some priests accepted the possibility of a miraculous sign, interpreting her survival as divine intervention. Others, however, insisted that it was a test, a trial of faith that was meant to be resolved through obedience to sacred burial rites. This division reflected a deeper tension in Sicilian culture, where faith, custom, and rational thought existed side by side, often in conflict. The village itself became a living laboratory of speculation. Taverns buzzed with conversation. Priests discussed the case in sermons. Families debated whether she should be feared or revered. And travelers came to see the woman who had defied the grave. Her name became a symbol, not just of one woman's fate, but of a question that haunted humanity. How certain can we ever be that death is final? The widow herself did not offer a clear answer. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were often vague, filled with fear and conviction. She insisted she had felt herself crossing into another realm, a space between life and death. Her description was poetic, almost dreamlike, a cold silence, a weight pressing down, a faint light receding into darkness. To believers, this was testimony of a miraculous awakening. To skeptics, it was a symptom of grief, delusion, or illness. No matter the interpretation, the case became a topic of wider philosophical and theological debate. It raised profound questions that extended beyond Sicily. What is death? How do we know when life has ended? What rights do the living have over the bodies of the dead? And what happens to the soul in the moments between life and death? Her case became a mirror reflecting the deep uncertainties of the age. In the years that followed, medical journals cited it. Clergy referred to it as a moral lesson. Folklore preserved it as a cautionary tale. And in Sicily, it became part of a long tradition of stories where the living and the dead were bound together in mystery. Ultimately, no single theory could satisfy all who heard her story. Science offered possibilities, faith offered miracles, superstition offered warnings. But none could erase the unsettling reality of her act. She had refused the grave. And in refusing it, she had left a question that could never be answered. Her story, preserved in the memory of her village and in the writings of those who debated her fate, became more than an incident. It became a symbol of a human truth, that death is not only a matter of biology, but of belief. That our understanding of it is shaped as much by fear and faith as by facts. And in that intersection between science and superstition, the story of the widow who refused the grave endures, a haunting mystery that still lingers in the shadow between life and death. The story of the widow who refused the grave did not end with her survival or the arguments that followed. What came next was an era in which her case became something far greater than the fate of a single woman. It became a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a living question that lingered in the minds of her village and beyond. In the weeks following the incident, the widow lived under the weight of extraordinary attention. Her home became a place of constant visitors, some curious, some skeptical, and others drawn by a sense of fear. Priests came to speak to her, urging her to accept God's will. Doctors returned to examine her, both out of concern and scientific curiosity. Travelers and journalists came from distant towns, hoping to witness the woman who had refused the grave. Her life became a spectacle, her body an object of inquiry and legend. Yet, despite the attention, her existence became one of isolation. Neighbors whispered about her in hushed tones. Children avoided her house, and even those who once knew her well kept their distance. In her refusal of burial, she had crossed a boundary, not only between life and death but between the living and the accepted order of the village. Her act unsettled people. It forced them to question traditions they had taken for granted and beliefs they had never examined. The church pressed her family to carry out the burial. For months, there was negotiation and debate. But her refusal remained steadfast. She insisted that no priest could bury her without her consent. To her, burial was not merely an act of laying the body to rest, it was a final surrender she was not prepared to make. Her fear of premature burial had become a vow. It was a way of maintaining control over her fate, even in death. Her home became her resting place. She lived out the remainder of her days in a quiet, shadowed existence, refusing the rites and resting she was denied. Neighbors came to see her less and less, and in time, her story became part of local legend, whispered at markets, told beside hearths, and passed down from one generation to the next. The case did not fade. Reports of her refusal spread to nearby towns and even reached Palermo. Scholars referenced her story in debates about death and burial customs. Clergy cited her case in sermons warning of the dangers of defying sacred rites. Medical journals discussed her condition as an example of the limits of diagnosis and the fear of premature burial. Her name, though lost to formal history, lived on in the stories of her village and beyond. For her village, her case left a lasting imprint. It became a moral tale about grief, fear, and the defiance of tradition. It was told as a warning and as a mystery, a caution about the boundaries between life and death, and about the dangers of refusing what is considered inevitable. But the widow's story also left a more unsettling legacy, one that endured long after her death. The fear she embodied did not vanish. In the decades that followed, Sicily continued to carry the shadow of her case. Families became more cautious. Vigil rites grew more elaborate. Safety coffins, equipped with bells and signals, gained popularity across Italy and Europe. Her story became part of a larger cultural fear, shaping the way people thought about death for generations. Beyond the village, her case became a symbol in broader debates about science, faith, and the unknown. It was cited in discussions about the need for more rigorous medical examinations, in theological debates about the nature of the soul, and in philosophical reflections on human mortality. To some, she was a martyr to fear and faith. To others, she was a woman who had challenged the power of tradition and law. In the end, the widow became more than a figure of history. She became a legend, a haunting reminder of the human fear of death, the limits of certainty, and the strange and fragile space between life and the grave. Her refusal of the grave was more than an act of defiance. It was a challenge to the certainty of death itself. It was a testament to the power of fear, grief, and human will. And it became a story that Sicily, and the world, could not forget. Long after she had gone, people still spoke of her in hushed tones. They told the story of the widow who would not rest, who refused the grave, and who in doing so left behind a mystery that would never truly be solved. Her life and her choice had become intertwined with the dark fascination of those who wonder what happens when death is no longer certain. The widow's grave, or rather the absence of it, became part of the law. For the people of Sicily, her story became an enduring question. If death can be refused, what does it truly mean to die? And in that question, her legacy remains, haunting, unresolved, and eternal. The widow's story did not fade with the passing years. Instead, it grew into something far greater, a story that became woven into the fabric of Sicilian folklore, a haunting chapter of history, and a cautionary tale whispered in the shadow of every graveyard. Her defiance of the grave left a mark not only on her village but on the culture of an entire region. For decades after her death, her case was cited in medical journals, legal debates, and theological discussions. Physicians referenced her as an example of the terrifying possibility of premature burial. Clergy spoke of her in sermons as a warning of pride and defiance before God. Writers and folklorists preserve her story in print, ensuring it would survive long after her name had been forgotten by time. Her legacy reached far beyond Sicily. Across Europe, In the years that followed, discussions about safety coffins, burial customs, and the ethics of declaring death were shaped, in part, by her case. Her story became part of a broader conversation, a symbol of the limits of human knowledge and the fragility of life itself. But it was not just her case that endured, it was the question she left behind. What is death? How do we know it has truly come? Who decides the moment when life ends? And what right does the living have to decide the fate of the dead? These questions echoed long after her voice had fallen silent. They became part of the moral and philosophical legacy of her story. In her village, her name became synonymous with mystery and defiance. Mothers told the story to their children, not merely as a cautionary tale but as a reminder that life and death were not always as certain as they seemed. Her story became a living legend, told beside graves and in hushed conversations in candlelit homes. The church eventually accepted her passing without burial, though the matter remained unresolved in the eyes of canon law. Her grave, or lack thereof, became a matter of speculation. Some said her body was kept at home for years, wrapped in linen and surrounded by prayer. Others claimed she was placed in a hidden crypt, her remains never truly laid to rest. The uncertainty only deepened the legend. For historians and folklorists, the widow's story remains a rare intersection of history, superstition, and human fear. It is a story that captures something universal, the fear of the unknown that follows death. In Sicily, where life and death have always been intertwined with ritual, her case became emblematic of a deeper cultural truth, that burial is not merely a physical act, but a symbolic one. To refuse burial is to refuse closure, to reject the finality of death itself. Her legacy also lies in the fear she embodied. The 19th century saw a surge of inventions designed to prevent premature burial. Safety coffins with bells, breathing tubes, and signal devices became a reality in part because of cases like hers. The widow became part of a larger movement to confront a primal fear, the fear that one might wake beneath the soil, unable to call for help. Her story became a haunting reminder of why humanity has sought ways to confirm death beyond doubt. But her legacy is not purely one of fear or science. It is also a story of defiance and human will. In refusing the grave, she asserted a power over her own fate that few dared to claim. Her choice, whether born of fear, faith, or desperation, became an act of rebellion against tradition, against the certainty of death, and against the authority of both church and law. It is perhaps this aspect of her story that endures most vividly. She became not just a figure of fear, but a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the face of death, there can be choice. And for some, her refusal of burial became a testament to the power of the human spirit to defy even the most absolute of endings. Over a century later, her story still resonates. It lives on in the pages of history books, in the whispers of local legend, and in the minds of those who confront their own mortality. It is a story that transcends the particulars of time and place, becoming a universal meditation on life, death, and what lies beyond. For those who study her case, the widow who refused the grave is more than a historical oddity. She is a mystery, a challenge, and a warning. She is proof that even the most certain truth, the truth of death, can be questioned. And in that questioning lies the enduring power of her story. Her legacy is a question without a definitive answer. It is a challenge to us all, to consider how we define death, how we confront it, and whether we have the courage to refuse it. The widow who refused the grave remains an enigma. She is part history, part legend, and part something that cannot be explained. Her story lives on because it speaks to one of the deepest fears and most profound mysteries of human existence, the moment when life ends, and whether we can ever truly be certain that it has. The story of the widow who refused the grave is not merely a historical curiosity or a strange anecdote from 19th century Sicily. It is a story that forces us to confront some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Questions about mortality, fear, faith, and the fragile boundary between life and death. In every era, death has been both feared and ritualized. Communities develop customs, laws, and religious practices to give meaning to the inevitable. In Sicily, burial was more than a physical act. It was a spiritual and social necessity. The rites surrounding death reassured the living that the deceased had safely passed into the afterlife, that the soul was protected, and that the community maintained its order. Yet, in her refusal, the widow disrupted the system, forcing those around her to confront the uncomfortable truth. Death, for all its rituals and assurances, is never entirely certain. Her case highlights the fragility of human knowledge. In 1866, medicine was limited, but even today, With all our technology, the finality of death is sometimes questioned, in cases of coma, near-death experiences, or other medical anomalies. The widow's story reminds us that the line between life and death is not always clear-cut. It reminds us that fear, perception, and human will can profoundly influence how we experience this transition. There is also a philosophical layer to her story. In refusing the grave, she asserted control over her own fate at a moment when human beings are usually powerless. Death is often described as the great equalizer, a force beyond choice or control. Yet the widow challenged this assumption. Her refusal was an act of autonomy, a statement that even in death, one can assert agency. It was a bold, unsettling declaration that life and its boundaries are not entirely dictated by others, whether family, law, or church. Her story also raises ethical questions that are still relevant today. Who truly has the right to decide the fate of the deceased? How should society balance individual fears and wishes with communal norms and religious expectations? These questions echo in modern debates about end-of-life care, medical ethics, and human rights. The widow's choice, extraordinary as it was, forces us to reflect on these dilemmas in both historical and contemporary contexts. Beyond ethics and philosophy, her story also speaks to the psychology of fear. The fear of premature burial was not irrational in her time. It was supported by reports, folklore, and cultural memory. But the intensity of her fear, the refusal to submit to burial, transforms it into something more profound. It becomes an exploration of how terror can shape decisions, how it can challenge tradition, and how it can endure long after the immediate threat has passed. The widow's experience also forces us to confront the cultural power of narrative. Her story was preserved not only through factual reports but through oral tradition, newspapers, and religious accounts. Each retelling shaped the perception of her life and death. Over time, the story became a legend, blending fact with folklore, reality with the imagination of a community steeped in superstition and faith. In this way, her story illuminates the human need to make sense of fear and the unknown through storytelling, a process that transforms individual events into enduring cultural lessons. In reflecting on her case, we also recognize the tension between science and belief. Medical science provided explanations, catalepsy, coma, or other physiological phenomena, yet faith and superstition offered alternative interpretations. Miracles, divine tests, and curses entered the conversation alongside medical theories. The widow's story illustrates that human understanding is rarely linear. We interpret the unknown through multiple lenses simultaneously, each shaped by culture, knowledge, and fear. Her life and defiance remind us of the universality of mortality. Every culture has grappled with the fear of death, the desire to control it, and the uncertainty of what comes after. Sicily, with its rituals and folklore, provides a vivid historical example, but the questions raised are timeless. What does it mean to die? How can we know it has truly happened? And, perhaps most unsettlingly, what if the act of death itself is not as final as we believe? Ultimately, the widow who refused the grave leaves us with no easy answers. There is no resolution to the mystery of her life, no definitive conclusion about her survival, and no universally accepted interpretation of her defiance. This ambiguity is precisely what makes her story so compelling. It occupies a space between history and legend, between the known and the unknowable. It forces us to confront mortality not as a distant abstraction but as a lived, tangible, and sometimes terrifying reality. Her story is a mirror held up to the human condition. It reflects our fear of the unknown, our desire for control, and our struggle to reconcile life and death. It reminds us that, even in the face of certainty, the certainty of death, the certainty of ritual, the certainty of tradition, there is always room for doubt, fear, and human will. And perhaps this is why her tale endures. It is not merely the story of a widow in Sicily, but a meditation on mortality itself, a dark, haunting, and unforgettable reflection on what it means to live, to die, and to challenge the boundaries that separate the two. In the end, the widow who refused the grave leaves us with a question that resonates across time and culture. If death can be refused, even for a moment, what does it truly mean to be alive, and what does it mean to be dead? The widow who refused the grave has become more than a figure in history. She has become a symbol, a haunting question suspended between life and death. Her story endures because it touches something deeply human, the fear of the unknown, the desire for control, and the defiance of what seems inevitable. Her refusal of burial was an act that transcended the personal. It became a confrontation with tradition, with authority, with the certainty of death itself. In that defiance, she left a legacy that is still alive today, not in physical form, but in the questions she bequeathed to humanity. What does it mean to die? Who decides when death comes? And is it possible to refuse it? These questions are as relevant now as they were in 1866 Sicily. Modern medicine has advanced immeasurably, but the fear of premature burial and the uncertainty of death has not vanished. Today, debates about life support, brain death, and the ethics of end-of-life care echo the dilemmas raised by her story. The widow's case reminds us that death is never a purely medical matter. It is also a moral, philosophical, and deeply human one. Her story also endures because of the way it was remembered. In her village, in Sicily, and beyond, her tale became legend. Oral tradition kept her memory alive, and newspapers preserved her story in print. It became a cautionary tale, a moral lesson, and a mystery whispered in graveyards. Her life became intertwined with the collective imagination, a blend of history, myth, and moral reflection. For historians, her case remains a study in ambiguity. There is no conclusive evidence that she was buried alive, nor is there proof that her refusal was purely an act of fear or madness. What remains is a story of uncertainty, a mystery that resists final answers. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy of all, the reminder that death, for all our attempts to define and control it, remains one of life's greatest mysteries. The widow's defiance also speaks to something more profound, the human desire for agency even in the face of the inevitable. Death is the one certainty in life, yet she challenged it. Whether driven by fear, faith, or will, her choice was a statement that even at the edge of mortality, human beings may assert control over their own fate. That defiance is a powerful part of her story. Her case remains a warning and a lesson. It warns us of the fragility of knowledge, the dangers of ignoring fear, and the consequences of defying deeply held beliefs. But it also teaches us something about human courage, the courage to stand against certainty, to question tradition, and to confront the mystery of death on one's own terms. In the end, the widow who refused the grave leaves us with no final answers, only questions. Questions about mortality and the limits of certainty. Questions about the rights of the living and the wishes of the dead. Questions about the power of fear and the strength of human will. Her story is a mirror held up to humanity's deepest fears. It reflects our uncertainty about death, our need for ritual, and our longing to understand what lies beyond. It reminds us that death is not a moment but a journey whose meaning is shaped as much by belief, fear, and defiance as by fact. The widow's tale is not simply a chapter in history. It is a meditation on mortality itself. It is a story that crosses boundaries of time and place. It is a reminder that death, for all its certainty, remains one of life's greatest mysteries. Her legacy endures because she refused the grave. That refusal was an act of defiance, a moral challenge, and a question that will never be answered. It is a story that will continue to haunt, to inspire, and to challenge those who hear it. As the centuries pass, as burial customs change and as science advances, the widow's story will remain, not as a closed case, but as an open question. A question that speaks to the heart of what it means to live and to die. And perhaps that is the widow's greatest gift to history, not the certainty of an answer, but the haunting reminder that death is not the end of a story. It is only the beginning of a question. Between life and the grave, there remains a space of mystery, a space filled with fear, faith, and the human will to resist. That space, and the story of the woman who refused to cross its boundary, will live forever. The widow who refused the grave is not just history. She is a question, a mystery, and an enduring echo of the fragile boundary that separates life from death.